Okay, last module before the exam. So basically, in the last module, we're talking about um, why phylogenies are useful, how we can test them, other things like that. And we saw why they're important. We can see that there's medical, but all kinds of other applications for these. We saw an example with the dinosaurs of when traits rose. Turns out feathers are really ancient things that exist in dinosaurs, and some of those dinosaurs evolved convergent flying abilities. They may not have flown as well as birds today, but again, they are flying from trees to trees, which is really amazing. Now let's do some other examples, just to show you that this is one of those skills that's really important for biology. Okay, here's a phylogeny of the group of animals called the canids, or the dogs, the family Canidae, that includes all the foxes and wolves, plus some other weird things like jackals and other really cool stuff. Here's dog, here's coyote. Now these things down here are not, they're kind of distant relatives. We've got bears, we've got elephant seals and walruses. They're carnivorans, so they're meat eaters, although these are weird exceptions, that are distantly related. But these ones up here are the living members of the family Canidae, just like we saw the example of the family Felidae, the family of cats. And then color-coded here are kind of different clades. Red clade, green clade, blue clade. You can go through, prove that they're a clade. And just like on the phylogeny on the exam, um, we can basically do something that's called molecular dating. You can ignore these numbers, but molecular dating basically says we can use how frequent mutations occur, what's called a molecular rate or mutation rate, to basically tell time. And so if two things have very few genetic differences, they probably branched very recently. If they have a greater genetic difference, they probably branched a long time ago. And we can use those differences to basically make a guess of when these ancient divergences occurred, when these ancient speciation events, when these branches occurred, when the nodes went their own way. And so, according to this phylogeny, here's the common dog. Um, of these species, which is most closely related to it? Pause your computer, go through Arctic fox, which is up here, black bear, which is down here, coyote, which is here, gray fox, which is, I don't know where the gray fox is, down here, or the gray wolf up here. Which of those is the most closely related to dogs? And the answer here is gray wolf. The wolf and the dog are very closely related. Coyote comes next, okay, and then you can kind of walk through it. So another question. Oh, I don't think it's on this. Yep. And if you read this phylogeny, what you'll see is that basically, when did that occur? Sometime well within the last million years, probably within the last couple 100,000 years, when humans were around, and probably we were involved in that evolution and in the process domesticating what were once wolf-like animals into what are now dogs. Um, Anatomically, actually very similar. And then all of the members of this family only go back maybe 10 million years. So this is a long time for you, but geologically, this is really recent. The last thing you call a dinosaur went extinct around 65, 66 million years ago. And so for 50 million years after dinosaurs existed, nothing like wolves and dogs and foxes existed. This is a pretty new group of life, which is pretty awesome. Could also look at biogeography. Wolves and dogs are kind of European, North American. So same with coyotes. And then as you get more distantly related, we have some African ancestors. So you can see this thing called biogeography. Okay, jackals are African. So this clade here is primarily African. Again, during this time, ancient human ancestors were also experiencing relatives of these species in Africa. And then as humans probably were, as some groups of humans were evolving outside of Africa, a lot of groups of humans stayed in Africa as well. Probably the evolution of wolves and dogs accompanied some of that pretty recent evolutionary history. Okay, just to show you this, this is the skeleton of a dog and a wolf, and I'm not going to tell you which one. Can you tell which is which? I bet you can't. You got to really know your canid philo or anatomy incredibly well to tell these apart. They're virtually identical, but if you put the skin back on them, the left is the wolf, the right is a, I don't even know what that is, some kind of a terrier. But again, they look quite different on the outside, but appearances are always deceptive. Anatomically, they're really amazingly similar. Again, this is a case where you find relatives on a phylogeny. They're going to have a lot of similarities because they have a very ancient shared history and a very recent unique history. So there hasn't been that much time for the anatomical differences to really evolve. Now, humans get involved, we can use our knowledge of genetics and breeding to make things evolve much faster than they normally do in nature. But again, we'll talk about that later on. Okay, now, do you think this really makes your life easier? Well, let's talk about a cool species of life, and I'm not even going to tell you what it is. It's Upupa epops. It's genus Upupa, species Upupa epops. Its common name is the hoopoe. Okay, you can see there's something going on with the word P, or the letter P. So think about it. Don't go online. Don't cheat. Tell me what you know about this species, Upupa epops. Upupa epops. Know anything about it? How's it live? What's it eat? How does it reproduce? Where does it live? Does it live on land? Does it live in the ocean? Does it breathe air? Does it have gills? Does it lay eggs? Does it have live birth? Is it warm-blooded? Is it cold-blooded? You probably can't do anything about this, okay? Because you don't know until you see a phylogeny. So here's a phylogeny. And here's the hoopoes or the wood hoopoes. And I'm not going to show you what it looks like, but now looking at this, you can see it's closely related to the hornbills. It's closely related to these groups up here that you can see examples of. So these are its three closest relatives. So based on this, now what can you tell me about this species, Upupa epops? You still don't know what it looks like, but I bet you can tell me some things. Does it have a beak? Does it have wings? Does it have feathers? Does it lay eggs? Does it probably build a nest? Looking at the phylogeny, its relationships. Does it live more on land? Is it big or small? Does it live on land, in water, or more in branches? Okay. Is it smaller, medium sized, big? Does it have a long beak or a short beak? Answer those questions based on its relatives, which are these ones up here, and make a mental image. And yeah, the outside's going to look probably wrong, but I bet that you basically had, yup, it's a longish beaked, small tree dweller. The color maybe you got wrong, but I bet you got it pretty accurate. Believe it or not, if you know how to read a phylogeny, you can summarize and simplify a lot. You tell me what clade something belongs to, and I can tell you tons of information about it, even though I don't know what it is. And you can use your knowledge of what you do know to all of a sudden make very informed, educated guesses. Now let's show you another example. This is one of the most famous phylogenies in all of science. This phylogeny was published in the early 1990s, so it's now 25, almost 30 years old. Okay, and it's a phylogeny here, not of organisms, depending on how you want to define it, but viruses. Viruses that infect the cells of organisms. And here it's a virus that they developed trying to get at HIV, which is a really important virus for human health and human medicine. And basically, here's HIV. There's a cluster of HIV here in humans, and they wanted to know where this virus came from. And one of the things about tree thinking is nothing comes out of nowhere. It always has relatives because we're all on one big tree. So they got the genetic material from HIV, they sequenced the genes, and then they also looked at other viruses and said, what are its relatives? And it turns out that there is a virus. It's not called human immunodeficiency virus, but simian immunodeficiency virus called SIV. Simian basically means ape or monkey. And it turns out that of all the groups of HIV, HIV was very closely related to this strain of virus called SIV that infects chimpanzees. And so looking at this um, led them to believe that chimps are the carriers of a virus that HIV probably evolved from. Um, and what's amazing is in chimps, pretty much every chimp on Earth has SIV. Super, super common. And they don't have a disease from it. It's just like lots of other viruses that you have that maybe in a flu you get it, but it affects you for a few days and then you just carry it the rest of your life and you're kind of immune to it. So if you're a chimpanzee with SIV, you're never sick from it. It doesn't make you sick. It doesn't impact you. It doesn't make your immune system go crazy. Only in humans does it do that. So if we can understand how it affects chimps, we might be able to cure or prevent HIV. Okay, that was one really big discovery. The second big discovery was that when you looked at this phylogeny, this isn't the only HIV. There's an HIV strain down here in the green clade, and this one isn't chimp derived. It came from what's called the sooty mangabe. Um, and so it turns out that according to this phylogeny, there is not just one type of HIV, there are two. In fact, now I believe there's a third that they found. Um, and it turns out there is no one disease called HIV. There's at least two. They're convergent. And in the early days of HIV research, one of the things that was really frustrating was if somebody had HIV and you treated it this way, they probably would at least not die quickly. But if you gave the same treatment to somebody else, they would die much faster until they realized two different versions of HIV. And you treat them totally differently because they're totally different viruses. Superficially, they're similar, convergently similar, but evolutionarily totally different in the way we treat them. So that today, when people are testing for HIV, they not only test do you have HIV, they want to know what strain, because the kind of strain you have fundamentally determines the treatment. Today, HIV-1 is the main one on Earth. There are some other strains. They tend to be very rare, um, but they do exist. And if you have those strains, it's a totally different drug treatment. So one of the big discoveries is that diseases that could be caused by a virus or bacteria or just genetically inherited, really important to do a phylogeny so we can figure out either groups of organisms to study. So if we're doing HIV work, we're going to use chimps, okay, because they behave very. Now chimps are very endangered, so you don't do this casually. But for things where it's really scientifically important, we're going to use maybe certain chimps that are unable to reproduce anymore or have some other issues that mean that they can't be in the wild or something like that. There are reasons we can kind of do these studies, and it's legal and ethical to do it. Okay, the final thing I want to cover is some other things that Darwin did. So we'll talk a lot about Darwin in the modules ahead, but he has lots of theories he actually invented. That's how amazing a biologist he was. He actually has some theories in geology he invented also. He's an insanely amazing scientist. But there's basically three other things that are not his big theory, which we'll talk about, called natural selection, that he also is credited with basically coming up with a hypothesis that we call a theory. One is this theory of common descent. Common descent basically argues that everything that has genetic material that we know of on Earth is related to each other. And so if it's bacteria, if it's a plant, if it's an animal, we're all related. You and me, very closely related. Me and a tree, very distantly related. Me and my cat, much more intermediately related. But if it's alive, if it has amino acids and proteins and DNA and RNA and cells and all of the stuff we talked about in the structural hierarchy, we're related in some way because the genes that make those have been inherited and modified through time into descendants. Um, he claimed that evolution fundamentally is a process of descent with modification, of ancestors having changes during descent. We use this concept when we define what a biological species is. It's throughout a phylogeny. It's really key to understanding evolution. Um, and the way we can connect this with phylogenetics is to treat these unique changes as basically synapomorphies, and then the branches of lineages as what's called a speciation event. Darwin did a lot of really important stuff. It's through and through phylogenetics.